The beginning of World War II. World War II, 1939 to 1945, was the biggest war in history. The war was fought on multiple continents. Tanks raced across the deserts of Egypt. Planes flew over frightened cities. Huge fleets swept across the Pacific Ocean. Two sides faced each other across the world. World War II also saw the greatest battles in history. Each of these battles played an important part in who would win the war. European countries had been arguing since World War I, 1914 to 1918. The world was changing. The United States was becoming the world's strongest power, while Britain's empire was shrinking. In Germany, a party called the National Socialists, Nazis, came to power in 1933. The Nazis believed white people were better than others. They especially thought they were better than Jewish people. The Nazis killed about 6 million Jews during the war. It was called the Holocaust. The war started with an invasion. The Nazis wanted to occupy Poland and Russia. In 1939, the Nazis invaded Poland. In response, Britain and France both declared war on Germany. World War II had begun. The Battle of Britain. The Germans took over France and then attacked Britain with bomber planes. This important battle was called the Battle of Britain. The battle took place during the summer and autumn of 1940. Day and night, German bomber planes flew over London and dropped bombs on the city. The British sent fighter planes to shoot down the bombers. Planes had deadly duels in the skies. They climbed high into the sky and dove through the clouds to attack each other. The Germans flew a fighter called the Bf-109. The British flew two different planes, the Spitfire and the Hurricane. The Hurricane was out of date, but it could be repaired easily. The Spitfire was faster than the Hurricane, and it turned more easily. In comparison, the Bf-109 was arguably the best fighter in the world at that time. The British had an advantage. They had new technology using radio signals called radar. It allowed them to find German planes in the sky from far away and surprise them. This helped Britain win the Battle of Britain. The Battle of Stalingrad. The Germans invaded Russia in 1941. The Soviet city of Kiev, along with 600,000 Soviet soldiers, were captured. By October of that year, 3 million Soviet soldiers were prisoners of war. Still, Stalin chose to continue to fight. The Germans particularly wanted to capture Stalingrad, which was an important industrial city. It was named after the Russian leader, Stalin. The Germans began a massive attack in 1942. Soldiers fought each other in the city's buildings. Bombs fell from the sky. Soon the city was in ruins. Stalin refused to let any civilians leave the city. He thought that the army would fight harder with civilians there. The Russian general Georgy Zhukov had a plan to trap the Germans. While the Germans attacked Stalingrad, the Russians surrounded the city. They trapped more than 250,000 Germans inside who could not escape. The German leader, Hitler, told his soldiers to stay in the city. He planned to send another army to save them. His soldiers in Stalingrad had no food or other supplies, and the long, cold Russian winter was coming. Sometimes the temperature was minus 30 degrees Celsius. The soldiers started to freeze and starve. In February 1943, the German soldiers surrendered. More than 2 million people died during the battle for Stalingrad. The German army never recovered. Attack on Pearl Harbor. The Japanese went to war with China in 1937. They wanted greater control of imports, exports, and important resources such as coal and oil. However, the United States disapproved of Japan's war with China. The Japanese were worried that the United States would attack them. Japan knew that having a powerful navy was essential to winning the war because the Pacific region is dominated by ocean. So they attacked the U.S. ships at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The Japanese believed that this would protect them from the U.S. Navy for some time. Early in the morning on December 7, 1941, Japanese planes surprised the Americans. Bombs fell on the ships. Soon ships burned and smoke filled the air. More than 2,000 people were killed and 19 ships were destroyed or damaged. The next day, America declared war on Japan. The Japanese made an error. Most of the U.S. aircraft carriers that could carry fighter planes and bombers were not in Pearl Harbor during the attack, so the U.S. joined the war with its most important ships still able to fight. The Battle of Midway. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese still hoped to destroy the U.S. aircraft carriers. In June 1942, the Battle of Midway began. The Japanese planned to invade Midway, capture it, and use it as their own military base. Midway Atoll is part of the Hawaiian Islands. The Japanese knew these islands were important because they were in the center of the Pacific Ocean. Japan wanted to tempt the American fleet into a trap. They spread their fleet out into groups so that the Americans would not find out how many there were. However, the U.S. armed forces were able to listen to the Japanese messages. They knew about the plans. Instead, they were the ones who surprised the Japanese fleet, which could not link up and help each other because they were spread out. Over 3 days, U.S. planes bombed Japanese ships. Bombs from under the water, called torpedoes, also struck the Japanese fleet. By the end of the battle, the U.S. had claimed a great victory. The U.S. succeeded in sinking 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, which had taken years to manufacture. The Japanese also lost many planes and important airplane engineers. From then on, the U.S. fleets dominated the seas in the Pacific Ocean. D-Day, landing on the beaches. By 1944, the Allies were winning in the Pacific and Europe. However, they still needed to land on the European continent and march into Germany so they could end the war. There was much debate about where to make the landing. The Germans had built up great lines of defense on Europe's beaches. The Allies knew any attack would be dangerous. Eventually, they decided to land in Normandy, on the French coast. It was the largest military landing ever attempted. Thousands of boats and planes and millions of people were assembled to cross over into France. On June 6, 1944, the Allies attacked. The sea was filled with ships. Bombs exploded on the German defenders. Over 130,000 Allied soldiers rushed up the beaches as the Germans shot at them. Can you imagine the sound of bullets flying past your ears and the rumble of bombs exploding everywhere? The German defenses were quickly overcome. Within weeks, more than 1 million Allied soldiers had landed in France. At midnight on May 8, 1945, the war in Europe officially ended. The Allies had closed in on Berlin, and the Germans surrendered. In August of 1945, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. Japan surrendered shortly afterwards. From then on, the U.S. became a superpower. At the end of World War II, country borders were redrawn. Germany was divided into 4 zones and controlled by the U.S., Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. This division led to the Berlin Wall in the 1960s. World War II killed off about 4% of the world population. It was the biggest event in the 20th century. What would have happened if the decisive battles had ended differently? Would the British now be speaking German if Germany had won the Battle of Britain? What if the Germans had claimed victory at Stalingrad? What would Asia look like today if the Japanese had beaten the U.S. at Midway? So what do you think? What could Germany and Japan have done differently? Could anything change how World War II ended? No one really knows the answers to these fascinating questions, but there is much that we can learn from history.